Welcome back to the Daily Word. I'm Jeremiah. We're in Galatians 2 this morning. Galatians 2, I want to look at 4 verses with you. Not the whole chapter, I want to look at verses 11 to 14. Remember, the context of the entire book is Paul is writing to the Galatians in order to correct them from buying into a false gospel, from believing that the gospel was no longer grace alone, it was grace plus works. And so we see that come to this dramatic confrontation in chapter 2, verses 11 to 14. Go ahead and look at verse 11. When Cephas came to Antioch, Cephas is just Peter. Paul is saying, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. In other words, Paul's saying, there was a significant issue with Peter that I needed to address. And I had to do it in a very personal and actually public way. He tells us what that was in verse 12. Before certain men came from Jerusalem, Peter used to eat with the Gentiles. But now when these Judaizing false teachers approached, when they came to Antioch, Peter stopped interacting with the Gentiles. And what he does here is he teaches us the first peril of this passage, and it's called the Peril of Fear. So what happened is Peter was eating and drinking and fellowshipping with Gentile believers, right? These aren't Jews. They weren't following Jewish dietary laws. They were Gentiles. And in fact, back in Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council decided that it wasn't necessary for Gentiles to live like Jews. So that was settled. Peter knew that. He was there at the Jerusalem Council. And so here, he's in Antioch eating with Gentiles. Not a big deal. But then some men come from James, which doesn't mean they were actually associates of James. It basically means that these were probably the party mentioned in Acts 15:1, these false teachers, these Judaizers. They came from Jerusalem. They claimed to be associated with James, claimed to be in league with James and have his support. And when Peter saw them, he got scared. He realized that they don't approve of me eating with the Gentiles, because the Gentiles don't follow Jewish customs. And these men, these Judaizers, these false teachers, were all about following Jewish customs. In fact, they were preaching a gospel that said, unless you follow Jewish customs, you can't be saved. In other words, you need works to complement the grace in order to get saved. Well, Peter sees them, and in fear of man, he backs out. He stops taking the Gentile phone calls, stops going to dinner with them, stops associating with them. And the reason was Peter was afraid. And this is the first peril in this passage. It's the peril of fear. Peter gave in to the fear of man. He wanted to be accepted by these Judaizers. He wanted their approval. And in order to get it, he had to back out of eating with the Gentiles. And in his backing out and his distancing himself from these Christian Gentiles, he was in effect tacitly saying the message these Judaizers are preaching is correct. Because he began to side with them. He began to fellowship with them instead. And so he gave implicit approval to the false gospel that they were preaching. And Peter's fear of man is something all of us face. We all face the fear of man. Who doesn't want people to be happy with us, to like us? I mean, think about this. How many times have you perhaps not evangelized because you thought it might be offensive? It might ruin a friendship. It might make that person mad at you. I mean, what is that but the fear of man? And we've all been guilty of that. You could also see the fear of man if, say, you are hanging out with friends or coworkers and they're using bad language, and, well, in order to be accepted, you use bad language because you're afraid of their disapproval. And so, again, things like that are so common to all of us, common even to Peter, one of the stalwarts of the church in the early times. And yet Peter gave into the fear of man, and he really just highlights the peril, the danger of the fear of man. Proverbs 29:25 says, the fear of man brings a snare. Basically, the fear of man is a trap, and Peter fell into that trap. Well, now there's a second peril in this passage, and why don't you go ahead and look at verse 13. This is the peril of influence. Verse 13 says, because of Peter's influence, the rest of the Jews there in Antioch also began to distance themselves from the Gentile believers. Not only that, But one unsuspecting, or rather one surprising guy starts to distance himself too. Barnabas. Paul even says, even Barnabas was led astray. In fact, Paul is surprised. How could Barnabas, noble Barnabas, the son of encouragement, how could Barnabas get wrapped up in this distorted situation? Well, it doesn't say other than to suggest that Peter's influence was the key. After all, Peter was a leader. He was a known figure. And so when Peter bailed on the Gentile believers, so did the other Jews. So did even Barnabas, a man who was faithful, a man who had traveled with Paul, a man who no doubt had had countless meals with new Gentile converts. And yet now he gets swept up in this tide of fear and man-pleasing. And so the second peril in this passage is the peril of influence. And whether you're a recognized leader or not, whether or not you have a big position at work or in the church or not, we all have influence. We all influence somebody. Maybe it's your kids, and you're a mom who's stuck at home all day, and you think, I don't influence anybody. But every child you have at home, you're influencing them. Maybe you're sort of a low-level employee at your job, and you don't supervise anybody. Nobody reports directly to you, so you say, I don't really have much influence. But in all likelihood, there's somebody with less experience and less seniority at that company who looks up to you because you know more than them. And so whether you're aware or not, you're influencing somebody. And that influence can either be something for righteousness or for ruin. We could influence them to Christ or away from Christ. And so that's the power and also the peril of influence. And it means we must be careful with our influence and how we behave and our example and what we say, how we act, how we dress. Because all of those things can either do tremendous good or tremendous harm. And in the case of Peter, sadly, it was tremendous harm. It was the peril of influence. And there's one last peril in the passage, and it comes in verse 14. And what it is the peril of hypocrisy. In fact, at the end of verse 13, it says that Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. And verse 14 illustrates that. In fact, in verse 14, Paul calls out Peter for his hypocrisy. He said their conduct wasn't in step with the gospel. In other words, it didn't match their gospel claims, that the gospel is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, because their conduct said, no, your works matter for salvation, because they were associating themselves with the Judaizing false teachers. That was hypocritical. It was saying one thing and doing another. In fact, that word hypocrite has to do with an actor in a mask, because who the person is different than who they look to be because of the mask. And so that's what Peter was doing. He was being hypocritical. And he was making it seem like the gospel required works, which was exactly what the Judaizers were preaching. But Peter actually didn't believe that. He knew it was a gospel of grace alone. But his association with the Judaizers, his removing of himself from the Gentiles, made it seem like he bought into a gospel of works plus grace. And hypocrisy is something we all have to be aware of. I mean, goodness, think of this. How many of us know biblical commands that we don't follow? We know it's wrong to lie, but we're tempted to cheat on our taxes. We know adultery is wrong, but we cast lustful glances here and there. It's all hypocrisy. And again, it's a peril we must all be on alert for, just like Peter, the man who was a titan of the faith, and yet he succumbed to hypocrisy here. And so as we think about Galatians 2:11-14, there are some perils to avoid in our own Christian lives so that we are not causing a stumbling block for others, but so that in fact our witness and our words point men and women to Christ for the glory of God. Well, that's all for today. We'll see you tomorrow morning.